Sa pagsikat ng araw, may dalang bagong pananaw. Naririnig mo bang busina? Palapit na ang pagbabago. Sama na, halika na.
Good day, everyone. How are you today? I hope you are doing well. Last meeting, we talked about inclusive education in our country, which is the Philippines. And this time, fasten your seatbelt because we are going around the world. We are going to talk about inclusive education in other countries. The question is, what's happening with inclusive education around the world? After listening to this video discussion, you will be able to share insights about the inclusive education in other countries. 148 countries, including the European Union, have ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the UNCRPD, and 158 have adopted the convention. In December 2013 class, a report entitled Thematic Study on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to Education from the UN Human Rights Council made clear inclusion and inclusive education is one of the key provisions of the UNCRPD. Article 24 commits state parties to developing an inclusive education system where disability should not prevent people from successfully participating in the mainstream education system. But this study demonstrates that although there have been moves towards inclusion, there are still many barriers, including lack of adequately trained teachers, accessible buildings, peer support, and challenging bullying, with much more integration than inclusion. The observations of the committee on the first 13 country reports also demonstrates a wide variation in practice. For example, in China is criticized for only integrating those with physical and mild visual impairments and for an expanding program of special school building. In Austria, which had developed moves to inclusion a decade ago, is criticized for lacking continuing momentum in this process. All 13 countries are urged to do more and reminded that the duty of making reasonable accommodations in the education for disabled people is not a progressively realized right, but must be implemented from the point of ratification. In March 2014, the Human Rights Council passed a resolution urging more to be done to implement the right to inclusive education. As these reports point out, implementing full inclusive education is a matter of political will, and where that consensus has been built, as in New Brunswick province in Canada, it can happen. In New Brunswick Policy Number 322 on inclusive education, it states that the following practices must not occur. Number one, segregated, self-contained programs or classes for students with learning or behavioral challenges, either in school or in community-based learning opportunities. And number two, alternative education programs for students enrolled in kindergarten to grade 8. The next question is, are we going to send all disabled children to school? Around the world class, we have much to campaign for in terms of developing inclusive education for all disabled learners. The global campaign for education in United Kingdom is focusing on getting the 40% of out-of-school children who are disabled into school. Class, that is 24 million out of 57 million children still out of school. They have activity entitled Send All My Friends to School, where they are going to give free pack for schools to work with pupils with KS1, 2, and 3. And this is an example or their practice in raising their awareness of this important issue about inclusivity. On the other hand, in England, we may feel that we are losing the battle in the argument for inclusion. Despite the weakening of the presumption of inclusion in the Children and Families Act of 2014, it is still there, with more than 90% of the 2 million disabled pupils and students attending schools and colleges. There have been big advances in many countries in getting millions of children into school, but the nature and quality of that schooling has not been adequate with a recent survey of 350,000 pupils in East Africa that includes Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, showing only 15% achieved expected literacy and numeracy levels. Class, when it comes to children with disabilities, as they are known internationally, the numbers in school in most developing countries, though there are no accurate figures, is likely to be less than 10%, and numbers completing primary education is less than 1%. So, as more children are successfully enrolled in school, the proportion of those out of school who are disabled are rising. Schools and learning are not generally accessible, and teachers do not know how to make reasonable accommodations or provide the right support. So the dropout of enrolled pupils with disabilities is high. Actually, class, there are many reasons why these are all happening. One of it is negative attitudes of parents and teachers, and actually that is the biggest barrier, followed by poverty parents. So children need to work so that they can provide for themselves and for their family. Next, of course, children can't afford school fees, even parents. Then, long distances to school, lack of accessible schools, and then lack of adequate teacher training. Let's talk about training all teachers for inclusive education. However, as demonstrated by the work for UNICEF on preparing teachers for children with disabilities, most teachers in developing countries get no training on including children with disabilities. If they do get training, it is based on special education needs model, where the focus is on separating the child from their peers to segregated classes and schools and focusing on what they cannot do from a medical model. There is an urgent need for all teachers, pre-service and in-service, to get twin-track training on including children with disabilities. There are actually two tracks. The first one is education based on principles of equality and child empowerment. That involves foundations and inclusive values which apply and are beneficial to all groups of marginalized learners and children. These includes the girls, nomads, rural, poor, child soldiers or orphans, those with HIV or AIDS, children with disabilities, linguistic and ethnic minorities, traumatized and displaced children. The principles to enable a child-friendly educational environment outlined by UNESCO are first, equality and valuing difference. Number two, identifying barriers. And when you identify the barriers, of course, you can already find solutions. Number three, collaborative learning. Of course, these children needs collaboration and peer support. Fourth, differentiation and flexible curriculum and assessment. Fifth, stimulating and interesting multisensory learning environment. Sixth, an anti-bias curriculum. Seventh, child-centered pedagogy, creative with reflective teachers. And finally, quality education requiring rigor and effort for each child to achieve their potential. Class, the second track is entitled Education Accommodating the Different Impairment Specific Needs of Children with Disabilities or Special Needs. Number one, we have for the blind and visually impaired pupils or students, we can utilize the Braille method, tactile maps and plans, tapes and text to talk, mobility training, large print, magnification, orientation, auditory environment, and talking instruments. For the deaf and hearing impaired pupils or students, we can utilize sign language, thought, and use of interpretation, oral or finger spelling, hearing aid support, visual and acoustic environments. For the deaf-blind language, we can use of interpreters, tactile environment, aids and appliances, and orientation. For the physical impairment, we can utilize accessible infrastructure, toilets and washrooms, furniture adjustments, equipment, prosthesis, use of personal assistance, diet, transport, and medication. For speech and communication impairment, we can use facilitated communication, augmented communication, that includes high and low technology, social use of language switching, talkers, and information grids. For specific learning difficulty, we can utilize colored overlays and background, easy read, tapes and text to talk, spell checkers, and concrete objects. For general cognitive impairment, we can utilize pictograms, small steps curriculum, easy read, scaffolding, Makaton, use of symbols and information grids, using concrete objects also is included. For mental health and behavior, we can utilize counseling and personal support, differentiated behavior policy, empathy, quiet chill out space, circles of friends, collaborative learning, and structured day. And of course, class, teachers who are assigned to do this in accommodating the different impairments, specific needs of children with disabilities or special needs, they need an introduction to screening, identification, and key adjustments for main impairments. Now let's go to Thailand. UNESCO Bangkok have produced a very useful online guide on how to go about implementing Track 2 in mainstream schools. This said, there are many examples of teachers developing the above expertise and including children with disabilities successfully. They are the exception rather than the rule and nowhere have come to scale. After several false starts, Tanzania is now working towards a more system-wide approach to inclusion of children with disabilities. Action on Disability and Development International have taken an overall responsibility for design, fundraising, implementation, coordination, monitoring, evaluation, and dissemination. The prospects for the coming period could change the few examples of inclusive practice into the norm, but there are two obstacles. Firstly, that is the pressure to marketize education increases, and more businesses view education services as the means of profit rather than a public good. Then, those who are seen as difficult or different from the norm will become an inconvenient truth, and as the currency of the market becomes standardized test scores, those who achieve differently or at a different pace will be squeezed out, and old models of segregation will reassert themselves. Secondly, as the world moves closer to all children being in school, the decreasing minority still out of school will not be funded. Class, the Office of High Commissioner on Human Rights have issued guidance to countries that they must consider disabled children when reporting on progress in establishing human rights. UNICEF have prioritized disabled children and young people in New York. Inclusive education class is present not only in those mentioned countries. The world is now embracing inclusive education. We need you, future teachers, to continue this inclusivity. Are you learning? I hope so. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Have a great day. Remember to always be kind to others and, of course, to yourselves. Take care. Bye.
Education.